Liam of Carcanne. Chapter 6. Southward. Part 3. When Otto had first suggested that the three needed to receive a blessing from Denholm before leaving on their trip, Liam had assumed he meant permission for him to go along with them. Otto had wasted no time in setting him straight. Now, Liam watched as Otto and Nori walked to the altar at the front of the chapel and took a knee to pray. Liam couldn't make out the words they were saying from his vantage point near the pews, only the quiet murmurs of their pleas to the goddess. He imagined that they were asking for safe passage on the road to the lumberjack encampment, and that none of them find injury in fighting the hobgoblins they were supposed to find there. After a few minutes, the murmuring from the two men faded, and Father Denholm stepped forward. Gently, he reached out and placed his hands on the back of their bowed heads. The three stood in silence for several long minutes as Liam watched with some curiosity. Coming from a mostly secular family, Liam had spent little time around churches, though he was certain that had his God-fearing grandmother known he was standing near an altar to a goddess, she'd have plenty to say about it. Despite what his grandmother's feelings would have been, Liam still required time to sort through a great many things that this world had presented to him. Giant wolves, magic, and gods were just some of the things on that list. Soon, he would be face to face with monsters he'd only read about in books. Hobgoblins. Who'd have thought it? As time ticked by, Denholm started to speak out loud, his words aimed at the spinning figure of the maiden on the altar. They spoke of long roads and heavy burdens, the safety of hearth and home, and return journeys under the mother's watchful eye. His speech had pauses for thought and moments for breath. It lacked any grandiose terms or meaningless platitudes. At times, Denholm was outright pleading with the goddess to keep them safe. Not just the two men of faith in front of him, but the unbelieving Liam as well. At its heart, the prayer was simply a dad asking someone to take care of his children while they were separated. The scene put into Liam's mind a great many partings that he had read about in books and seen in film, made all the more powerful by Denholm's steadfast earnestness in his requests. There was no acting here, no showboating for greater offerings. The father's love for his congregation really did know no bounds. As Denholm again fell silent, he removed a hand from the back of Otto's head and waved Liam forward. At first he hesitated. Liam had made it clear to Denholm that he wasn't sure about participating in the blessing. Now, in the moment, however, Liam found himself stepping forward and taking a knee next to Otto. His eyes lingered on the maiden statue for a moment before he, too, bowed his head and closed his eyes. In his peripheral vision, before everything went dark, he saw Denholm raise his hands into the air and open his mouth to speak again, this time to his goddess as a whole and not the statue in front of them. Mother Goddess, Maiden Love, and Mediator Understanding, Denholm's long speech began. His tone here was far cooler than it had been only moments before. His typical humble demeanor fell aside and was replaced by one of power and authority. These new words floated by, wrapped in precise pronunciation, punctuation, and timing. Every bit of silence was used purposefully to accentuate the words around it. It didn't take long for Liam to find a rhythm and flow to the words being spoken. In stark contrast to the fatherly pleas of only moments before, this speech was well rehearsed and repeated perfectly. The longer the maiden's priest spoke, the more Liam could feel time dilating around him. The sensation of the candlelight beyond his eyelids and the air on his skin seemed to come and go with the pulse of Denholm's rhythm. At some part of the ritual, Liam couldn't be sure when exactly, he began to feel a crisp warmth radiate out, slowly, from his belly. The sensation was electric and friendly, spreading slowly to his limbs and into his face. For the first time in his life, Liam became aware of the feeling of the hair on his head and sensations in his fingernails. His last thought before the sensation pulled him away from time completely was a fear that he might sneeze and ruin everything. Slowly, as if for the first time in years, Liam's eyelids lifted and he could again perceive the world around him. Taking a moment to revel in the feeling of the air returning across his skin, he discovered the faintest remnants of the tingle that had accompanied the other sensations that had swam through his body. Focusing on that feeling set it running from his body. Any place he set his mind to experience the sensation, it scurried from as if it were a living prey running from a predator. It took mere seconds for the feeling to recede completely, exiting his body through his toes. Softly, his existence shifted back to its usual perceptions. The first thing to come into focus as his eyes found new life was the maiden statue on the altar. He allowed them to rest on her eternally twirling form for only a moment before looking for his companions. The space beside him was vacant, but only a few feet away Nori remained, his eyes closed and head bowed. Beyond him, talking quietly amongst themselves, Otto and Denholm sat on the pew closest to the altar. After reaffirming his existence in the reality he had most recently occupied, Liam sat motionless for a few minutes. He had a lifetime of religious beliefs and assumptions to parse through. Had he just been touched by a god? No, not a god, capital G. The kind of being his grandmother wholeheartedly accepted as part of her life, and the rest of his family believed in when she was around. If the goddess was real, which, if he were honest, was getting harder and harder to deny, did that mean the god of Abraham back home was real? If not, some other god? Liam's mind whirled with the potential for 1,000 new life paths spreading before him based on these new possibilities. Then it all came tumbling back down again as he recalled one of his and Denholm's earliest discussions. Miracles in the church, according to Denholm, were direct interactions with the goddess. Members of her clergy were gifted with the ability to request her power and use it to perform acts typically beyond themselves, outside of magic. However, Denholm had confessed even he wasn't sure that all these gifts weren't just high-level spells wrapped in a religious container. Had that been what this was? Instead of Liam's first interaction with an entity far larger than himself, had this just been Liam's first personal experience with magic? I can't say there isn't something to all of this, Liam thought as he rose and looked back to the statue. I am only standing here because of signs and visions. Magic or otherwise, I have committed myself to this path. But if this were Grandma's church back home and that had happened, I'd be buying the book. You all right? Nori's voice drew his attention as he too rose to his feet. I'm not sure, Liam replied before returning his gaze to the whirling figure on the altar. This was Liam's first interaction with the goddess, Denholm explained, rising from his seat. I'm sure it has given him some things to consider. He'll have plenty of time to think on the road. Otto stood as well. Of course. Denholm smiled and motioned toward the door of the chapel. You'll need to get a move on if you're going to cross the river while it's still light out. Have you been where we're going? Liam asked Denholm as they walked through the pews to the door. No, the priest shook his head. Otto was just telling me about the journey, and I've walked the Valheran road enough times to have a rough idea of the path you're about to take. As the group emerged back into the pre-dawn darkness of the city, Denholm gripped Liam's elbow and held him back for a moment. Once the other two had walked out of earshot, Denholm pressed something into Liam's palm. It was thin and teardrop-shaped, with an almost waxy smooth texture on one side and dull ridges along its edge. Liam raised his hand to get a better look. A leaf? He asked, confused. In the dim light of the candelabra, the dull green of one side was barely discernible from the bright green of the other. It's from the lemon tree, Denholm explained. I thought since the goddess had acted through it for your benefit in the past, it would be good for you to take something of it with you. Thank you. Liam raised the talisman to his nose and breathed in. The smell of fresh-cut grass and summer days in his childhood backyard overwhelmed his senses. For the briefest of seconds, he thought he could see his mother and sister playing in a kiddie pool while his dad walked behind their lawnmower when he was small. It all flashed by so quickly as the smell left a wave of forgotten memories and emotions churned up in its wake while it swept through his brain. Then, just as suddenly as it had been there, it was all gone. I thought it might be something to help keep the wolves away, Denholm said as he lowered the leaf from his nose. I think it will do just that. Liam smiled before carefully placing the leaf securely in the pouch in his belt. The length of the western Great Cardinal Road stretched out as far as Liam could see in front of the trio. Somewhere beyond the horizon in front of them, the town of Dorslaw lay, and beyond that, Royce Castle, Carcanne's capital. One of these days, Liam would get to see them both, but not on this trip. They would be splitting off of the western branch onto another southern road sometime before reaching Dorslaw. You know, stories talk a lot about riding off into the sunset, but riding off into the sunrise is not nearly as epic as I had pictured. Liam called out to the two riding side by side ahead of him, one hand on his horse's reins, the other covering his eyes. I told you to buy a hat, Nori admonished the younger adventurer, his own eyes covered by the oversized rim of a worn straw hat. I ran out of time. Liam put little effort into defending himself. There was simply no point. Even if he managed, he was still the one stuck covering his eyes from the rising sun. A rookie mistake, Otto agreed. His own felt hat's brim wasn't as large as Nori's, but still plenty large enough to keep the sun out. What stories do you think he's talking about? Otto leaned over in his saddle to whisper to his partner. I don't know, Nori shrugged. I've just taken to ignoring the references I don't get. Sound plan. Otto decided to follow his partner's words as he pulled himself straight back into the saddle. It would be some hours before Liam finally got some relief from the sun. Still early in the day, their journey turned off of the western branch and onto what Denholm had referred to as the Vilheren Road. This road took them south, finally pushing the sun from Liam's eyes and leaving it to continue its climb off to their left. He wasn't completely free of the sun's wrath, however, as the grasslands the Vilheren Road crossed were even more bereft of shade than the Gap Valley had been. As the sun approached midday, the Vilheren Road brought itself into line with a wide river running south for a brief time. Otto pulled the group to a stop at the first stand of trees they came to along its waters. We'll rest here a bit and let the horses drink, Otto said, sliding effortlessly from the back of his horse. Nori led his horse to the river before dismounting. Without any provocation, his horse took to drinking from the cool waters. Absent-mindedly, he pet his horse as he moved back to his saddlebags, only stopping upon spotting Liam, who was currently fighting to free his foot from a wayward stirrup while simultaneously attempting to dismount his horse. Are you all right? Nori asked, drawing Otto's attention from where he had been rooting through his supplies for his lunch. Fine, thanks, Liam assured him as he managed to finally pull his foot free, the sudden release of which caused him to suddenly half slide, half fall from the saddle. His knees buckled under his weight as soon as his feet hit the ground. He landed strung out across the grass and groaned. You sure about that? Otto asked, turning his attention from the scene back to his saddlebags. No. Wait a minute before you try to get up, Nori offered advice as Liam's horse walked slowly away from its rider and joined its stablemates in drinking from the river. Let the blood flow back to your legs before you try again. Got it, Liam said from his prone position, striking a comical pose as he threw an arm in the air and held a thumb up. It took time, but Liam finally managed to get to his feet and stumble his way back to his horse. Once there, he pulled a small drawstring bag from among his belongings before turning back to the small stand of trees. There, Otto and Nori were sitting with their backs against the wood, legs outstretched, eating lunch and watching him with some interest. You know, Nori commented as he approached, you could have told us you'd never ridden a horse before we left. The stablemaster gave me a few lessons yesterday, Liam pointed out. I thought I'd be good. He leaned against the tree with the other two, choosing to stand to allow more blood to flow into his legs. This explains why the stablemaster was so insistent on you getting the nag, Otto chuckled. It was the only horse he thought I could ride long distance, Liam admitted, reaching into his bag for some of the fresh fruit Denholm had gifted to him before he left. You have got to be kidding me! Liam almost dropped the bag in his hand as his shoulders and head slumped in unison against the bark of the tree. What? Nori asked. Liam pulled his closed fist from the bag and held it out where Otto and Nori could see it. Slowly, he turned it palm side down and opened it. A dark, grit-filled handful of dirt fell to the ground in front of them. What is that? Otto leaned forward to see around Nori. It's fertilizer. Liam let out a defeated sigh. The stuff the church gives Denholm for the garden. Why did you bring that with you? Otto took a big bite out of an apple. I must have grabbed the wrong bag. It's supposed to be berries Denholm picked for me. Yeah, I wouldn't eat that if I were you. Otto swallowed his chunk of fruit and the laughter started. First Otto, then Nori, and finally, with no real choice, Liam had to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Just as slowly as it had joined the river, which Otto explained was the Gap River that ran the length of the valley and past Stawson, the Vilheren Road would again pull away from it before coming to a large junction. Another road, poorer maintained than the one they were currently on, cut off to the east, a worn sign that the junction was too faded for Liam to read from horseback. That connects back to the Southern Great Cardinal Road, Nori explained to Liam, where it turns into the Mandroat Road and takes you straight to the Great Dry Wall. Great Dry Wall? Liam repeated. What's that? Otto let out a small chuckle, but was cut off by a dirty look from Nori. Sorry, he excused himself. Please explain. The Great Dry Wall, Nori only broke loose his glare from Otto after repeating the phrase, is the name of the great cliffs at the western edge of the giant desert canyon at the heart of Mandroat. Nori sat up straighter in his saddle as he spoke. It sounds impressive. Liam looked to Otto, who nodded his agreement but remained quiet. How tall are the cliffs? 5,000 feet, Nori's evident pride in his homeland and its defining natural feature radiated far beyond the trio. That's almost as deep as the Grand Canyon, Liam thought as Nori continued. Since Carcanne was founded, only one invading force has ever made it to the cliffs, and none have ever passed its defensive. That's why Mandrot itself is nicknamed after the cliffs, the Great Wall of Carcanne. Only the locals call it that, Otto said with a mischievous grin on his face. No one has tried to invade Carcanne from Oswil in over 200 years. Because of the Mandrot and Oswil's fear of the wall. Or the peace treaty that the king signed 200 years ago. Liam did his best to hide a smile, watching Otto and Nori go back and forth about Nori's homeland. It was obvious this wasn't the first time the two had done this, and Otto was definitely getting more joy out of riling up Nori than Nori was getting defending his home. So how about this road? Liam finally cut Otto off after a couple of minutes of bickering. Nori's light brown skin was beginning to redden, and the whole production had become painful to watch. Where does it go? A good 5 days' ride from here, it will cross to the other side of the river. Otto motioned towards the south. And another 3 days or so beyond that, it ends in the lands of the Valherin family. This time it was Nori's turn to scoff. It leads into Genwevel, and splits off before you get to Mainbombriac, the dukedom's capital. Where it leads to the domain of the De Valherins, Otto repeated his answer. Isn't that the name of the road? Liam asked, remembering what Denholm had called it that morning. The De Valherin family owned some of the mines in Genwevel. Nori took up the explanation. And a large chunk of the land in the eastern portion of the valley. They're the ones who built this road. Otto gestured to the ground they were riding on. They paid to have it built. No Valherin has touched a tool in probably 100 years. Nori rolled his eyes. Story goes the family had this road built to compete with the Southern Cardinal Road after a falling out with one of the kings ages ago. Must be nice to afford that kind of thing. It was the kind of move Liam would expect from some of the more petty billionaires back home. Well, see, Nori looked around like someone might suddenly appear from the tall grass along the road and hear what he was saying. They like to think themselves part of the nobility, some ancient line of royals or some such. Their holdings easily have the money to pull off the act, but rumor has it they're just pretenders. Be careful who you say that around, Otto butted in, especially in the south. There are plenty loyal to the Baron and his so-called pretenders in Genwevel, whether they cause trouble for the Duke and the crown or not. So is that where we're headed now then? Liam asked after Otto's words hung loose over their heads for a moment. Genwevel? Technically, we're already there. Everything south of the western branch and east of the Southern Cardinal Road is Genwevel, Nori explained. Doesn't that cut Stossen in half? Liam was confused. Denholm had been teaching about local politics, but it was far from an expansive education. The Duke of Genwevel mostly concerns himself with the valley at the center of his lands. Nori motioned towards the mountains on the other side of the river. The range that was typically to the south of them in Stossen had made its way to their west as they rode. The Gap Valley is managed by the Guntruvel family, the Dukes of Brodeman. I don't really know why. I think it's just simpler that way. He looked to Otto for help. No idea, the Stossen native shrugged. Over time, some of the borders just shifted off of the cardinal roads, I guess. Mandrot doesn't do much to manage the gap between the wall and the southern road, does it? It was Nori's turn to shrug. I guess not. The Guntruvels oversee Brodeman right up to the cardinal road in the north. They're insistent on it. But down here, the area between the Great Dry Wall and the Valherin Road is, well, it's not lawless. No, not by any means, Otto agreed with his partner. There are towns and villages sprinkled across the plains that go about their day-to-day lives just fine. I'm just not quite sure how. I'd never really thought about it before. Nori held up his hands in another mock shrug. Neither had I. It wasn't much further into their journey that Otto shifted the trio from the Valherin Road onto a smaller trail that led back towards the Gap River. There were no signs to mark it, and if it weren't for the ruts from recent wagon wheels on either side of the trail, Liam would probably have thought it was a game trail, if he had noticed it at all. For the next part of the passage, Liam found himself in the lead, with Otto in the middle and Nori lagging behind them. The two well-traveled adventurers re-donned their hats to keep the sun out of their eyes again, leaving Liam to ride one-handed. He got no relief until the sun finally crept back below the high mountains ahead of them, casting their path in long shadows. Soon after the early dusk, Liam spotted the banks of the river and slowed his horse to allow Otto and Nori to draw alongside. We'll stop here till morning, Otto said as he pulled up alongside Liam. I was hoping to camp closer to the woods on the other side tonight, but this will have to do us. How far to the woods? Liam asked as Otto dismounted. Another 2 or 3 hours. We could make it, Liam said, reaching down and patting his horse's neck. She's still got plenty left in her. That's all well and good, Nori said, pulling his horse up to the group. But it would be smarter for us to wait and make the crossing when there's more light. It's not really that. Liam realized he was getting argumentative and cut himself short, instead electing to try and make a successful dismount of his horse without falling flat on his butt this time. It's dark enough, Otto still addressed Liam's comments. If it were just Nori and I would say push on. But since I'm here, it's an issue. Liam's words came out muffled as his belly slipped along the side of the saddle and he landed hard on his feet, this time managing to keep from falling over. I'm not about to try and teach you how to ford a river, even one this shallow, when it's not fully light out. Don't take it as an insult, Nori reassured Liam as he stepped from his horse. You're just new to this, and all it takes is one misplaced hoof and your horse can get seriously hurt. All right. Liam took the reins of his horse and walked her to the river to drink, the way the three had earlier that day. I get your point. Okay then. Nori walked up behind Liam and patted him on the shoulder. Let's get camp set up. We'll eat something and get some sleep. Up at dawn again tomorrow, Otto said, already working to take the saddle off his horse for the night. We should be at the lumber camp sometime around noon. Liam of Carcanne was written by Will Hansen. This chapter has been read for you by the author. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not leave a comment? I'd love to hear what you think. Likewise, every like, rating, and subscription helps. Liam of Carcanne is now available as a podcast on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, and all other major podcast distributors. Want more information on Liam or Will? Visit the Wooks Books YouTube channel, Facebook page, or website, all linked in the description. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you next time.